I want to talk about the F-16 deliveries that are going to Ukraine, slotted to happen soon. So welcome back, I'm Chris and this is Military Aviation History, and today we're going to talk about all of that. I have invited Professor Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute to give his perspective on this issue. Now there's lots of questions that we have right here, and there's not a lot of granularity of what actually is going to happen, since not that much information has actually been released yet. What we can say, however, is that the F-16 is not going to magically win the war or even magically achieve air superiority, especially not in the short run, as Ukraine is most likely going to receive initially only low numbers and use them probably very sparingly. What we can also say is that it is unlikely that Ukraine will use them exactly in the same manner as NATO countries would, because they still have in many ways a legacy of sort of Soviet-style command and control and mission planning for their air force, although that of course will change significantly as time goes by. So I think there's a really interesting discussion here that we can have about what is most likely going to be the mission profile of the early F-16 deliveries, what the pilots are going to be doing with them, what the mission planning is going to be doing with them, and also some of the challenges and opportunities that come with that. So we're going to jump right into the interview with Justin Bronk. This is a primer interview, so it contains some of the points he makes in the full interview, which is 45 minutes long. If you want to check that video out, you can already do so as patrons and channel members in early access. And now, without further ado, let's get to it.
What sort of air operations do you then expect to see on the Ukrainian side with the first introduction of the F-16?
I think the majority of what they'll be doing when they initially come into theatre will be contributing. Well, first of all, they'll be practicing the concept of operations, which will have to have an element of dispersal both on the main bases, and dispersed operations at various sites around the country. Not least because if they're flying at low level for a lot of the time that they're within a couple of 100 kilometers of the front lines to stay underneath the SAM threat, they'll be using a great deal of fuel. As you know from flying the Gripen, when you're at very low level, your fuel flow is in a jet engine is anywhere from about 5 times to more than 10 times the fuel flow that you would have for the same indicated airspeed at high altitudes. Jet engines just burn a lot more fuel lower down. And because the Ukrainians don't have and couldn't use air-to-air refueling tankers, they'll have to land to refuel. And so again, if they're doing long combat missions, just as now, they'll have to use forward refueling points. So again, that dispersed operations model, especially if they're talking about pilots who haven't flown it before in other types, if they're coming out of the ab initio training, that will take some time to get used to. F-16 is not really designed for that, and so there'll need to be some work up there. But during that time, they can be contributing to sort of air defense inside the country. So potentially trying to intercept, particularly Shahed 136 type one-way attack munitions, maybe cruise missiles. That's a pretty difficult mission set, especially without an active electronically scanned array type radar, because these are small targets. The cruise missiles, some of them, the KH-101s, we'd say AS-23, have a relatively low radar cross-section, and they'll be flying low, so you're trying to potentially pick them out of ground clutter. And again, with the APG-68, it's not easy. But also, even Sidewinders are pretty expensive compared to Shaheds. Cruise missiles, not so much. That's a pretty decent exchange, but it's not a be-all or end-all answer to the internal air defense side. But no doubt they'll have some utility there and provide a threat in being to act as a further deterrent for Russian forces trying to push air, whether rotary air or fixed wing, across the Ukrainian front lines. So they'll have value there, and they'll no doubt be doing some launching of weapons air to ground in much the same way as the current Ukrainian aircraft are doing. So lobbing glide bombs and that sort of thing, launching harm for air defense suppression and targeting. So yeah, I think that'll be the baseline. The difficulty is likely to be that if you're talking about going after the glide bomb, sorties, which are one of the key requirements at the moment because the glide bombs are causing a lot of damage and a lot of problems. F-16 is unlikely to give Ukrainians the effective range to do that, at least not without flying missions that have, should we say, a very high risk profile. Because a traditional air-to-air missile like AMRAAM, it has a rocket motor. That rocket motor might fire for, call it 7 or 8 seconds, depending on the variant, depending on the scenario, circumstance, but call it 7 or 8 seconds. So during that time, the missile is accelerating. So you can imagine already that if you fire that AMRAAM from Mach 1.4 at 35,000 feet, then it's already high. It's already in relatively thin air. There's already not much drag. And if you loft it slightly, so you pull up, by the time that motor is burned out, it could be at 60,000 feet where there's almost no drag at all, with a huge amount of gravitational energy and at many times the speed of sound. And so following the motor burnout, that missile would then have a huge amount of energy to glide through the rest of its flight. And so when it arrives at a target that may be maneuvering, it's got quite a lot of energy to kind of make turns to try and complete the intercept. And if the target turns away and is trying to run away, it's still got a reasonable amount of energy to try and catch up to it, although a fast jet turning cold, so turning away and igniting the afterburners to try and go in the other direction because it knows it's been fired at is a very difficult target for air-to-air missiles to catch up to unless the missile is fired very close. But if you fire that same missile that might go, tens and tens of kilometers with a decent effective range, from Mach 1.4 at 35,000 feet, that same missile fired from Mach 1-ish, or maybe 0.9 even, at 200 feet, is starting in very dense air at a slower speed. So there's a lot more drag. That motor burn will accelerate it to a significantly lower speed up front. If the target is, as Russian flankers would be and glide bomb sorties would be, at high altitudes and speed, that missile is also having to climb during its motor burn. So it's to go from the low altitude you fired it to the high altitude where the target is. So by the time the motor burns out, again, the same 7 or 8 seconds, it's probably only at a couple of times the speed of sound. It's still climbing, so it's going to be losing speed quickly. And so the effective range of that same missile will be vastly shorter than if you fired it at supersonic speeds at high altitude. And this really matters in Ukraine because it's not really possible to take something like an F-16 and accelerate to supersonic speeds at high altitude. That takes time. That takes minutes, typically with a fuel load of a couple of tanks. So you have to be up at altitude for some time, which means that you'll be visible to long-range Russian SAMs, S-400s, S-300s, and you can be engaged at hundreds of kilometers. So even if you detect that you've been fired at and you turn to notch and probably go down back to low altitude and turn cold to try and defeat that shot, your air-to-air engagement is now gone. You can't. So you can't do those engagement profiles anywhere near the front lines in Ukraine, as the Ukrainian Air Force. So I don't think F-16 with AMRAAM, especially the versions they're likely to get, is going to provide an immediate answer to those glide bomb threats, because the glide bombs are being released from 60, sometimes more, kilometers behind the Russian front lines at high altitudes and speeds by definition. So they're a pretty difficult target to intercept. So the combination of radar performance not being fantastic, the weapon being relatively short range when fired from low altitudes, just means that mission profile is probably pretty difficult to do. You'd have to go very close to the front lines, pop up, fly at high altitudes for a significant period to try and get that missile reach, and coordinate the timings perfectly and hope you weren't shot down by ground-based air defenses. And of course, the Russian fighters will also be engaging with their long-range air-to-air missiles from a high perch down to the low. So with R-37M or AA-13, with much more powerful radars. So this is not a wonder weapon. It will provide some benefits for Ukraine, but it's not going to sort of get them air superiority all of a sudden. That's not within the realms of possibility for the system.
I mean, on that note, it of course depends on what the Ukrainians want to do with their F-16s. But given sort of the numbers that we find in the public domain of how many F-16s are likely going to be sent in this sort of first delivery. How many aircraft would Ukraine actually need to have a sort of field a credible force where it can then extend the activities of the F-16 beyond just doing this a little bit of air defense that it probably would do in the first run-up?
The Ukrainian public estimates for the rough size of force they need is somewhere between 180 and 200 aircraft. It's about 4 regiments worth in their system. But I mean, first of all, it's worth stating that the limitation at present is not the number of F-16s that partners have undertaken to donate. There are more F-16s being donated to Ukraine than there are pilots ready to fly them. So pilots is the limitation. And by the way, the same thing goes for the Gripen argument of, well, but there aren't that many Gripens around, so how could they be available in big enough numbers? There are more Gripens than there are pilots to fly them. So that's not the issue. So the numbers that will go in will depend on a few factors. Firstly, pilots, how many pilots are at an acceptable level. Secondly, maintenance crews. So how many contractors do you have to support how many Ukrainian maintenance teams, and how capable are they with what ground support equipment, and how many locations can they operate around in a dispersed way within the resources and personnel that they can allocate. And then there'll be a trade-off between how much air defense you can place and missile defense you can place around main operating bases to force the Russians to really fire big salvos to get through, versus whether you try and go for a low-profile dispersed operational model. But in any case, the more aircraft you give the Ukrainians in country, the harder that challenge becomes to keep them ahead of the Russian surveillance and long-range reconnaissance strike complex. The numbers that are likely to be supportable in country anytime soon will fall a very long way short of that estimate for what Ukraine would need to kind of have its needs met from an F-16 point of view. That is a much more long-term project.
But in the discussion that we have with the F-16, what sort of pops to mind where you would say that's a challenge, we need to think about that, and that's an opportunity that really should be appreciated more?
The biggest one would be the need to find a sustainable way and prove it to destroy Russian medium-level surveillance UAVs penetrating deep into Ukrainian airspace before Western fast jets of any kind are deployed in country. Because if they're deployed without an answer to that particularly Orlan 10 problem, so these are medium altitude, long endurance, small reconnaissance UAVs which can fly above the reach of shoulder-fired manpads and AAA generally. And at the moment, Ukraine is struggling to shoot them down because there isn't enough ground-based air defense ammunition for the bigger systems to quote unquote waste them on these small UAVs. There needs to be a way of sustainably keeping those out of in deep Ukrainian airspace. Otherwise, it will be almost impossible to run the sort of dispersed operations that are going to be necessary to stay ahead of Russian targeting, which will concentrate on those F-16s or Gripens or anything else that are put in because they're such a politically sensitive target and represent a potentially capable asset for Ukraine. So the Russians will target them. We saw 3 weeks ago, we saw 4 days in a row of strikes on Ukrainian main air bases targeted by Orlan 10s, which were loitering for a couple hours in some cases over those bases and then calling in ballistic missile strikes. If that sort of thing is going on, then it doesn't matter how good your dispersed concept of operations is. That will be a killer, not just of the aircraft and the aircrew, but also the ground crew and the maintenance staff and the ground support equipment. So, yeah, that I think is a dependency that's not often discussed as much, but that must be fixed before the fast jets go in. Otherwise, they'll be destroyed on the ground.
I hope that you enjoyed that. If you did, I hope that you enjoyed that. If you want to add anything, want to provide some feedback, some analysis of your own, or just want to say, hey, I learned something here, put them in the comments below. They are open as always for all of you. Big thank you here to Justin Bronk for his time and answering all the questions. Please also put your appreciation to him in the comments below. And also all Patreons and channel members, thank you for making this channel possible. Check your feeds for all the early access videos that are available. And as always, everyone, have a great day and see you in the sky.